So it's pretty clear that humans are social animals, that while there are very rare examples of people who love their own solace, most human beings gather together in communities that start and are built out from their near family, but often involve quite extensive family and community, that we get a lot of both physical and psychological support from being in communities. And so how we house ourselves is an integral part of both physical security and mental well-being. And in the industrial age, as we began to move from rural populations to more denser urban populations than we'd ever seen on that scale previously, we began to deconstruct communities and reconstruct housing in a different way. And it's not surprising that we now find ourselves with social structures that are not necessarily compatible with our built environment. And as we begin to look at a future where we are going to need to live closer to where we work and earn our living, and where technologies are going to enable us to do that, we're going to have different social structures. But to maintain social cohesion, you need to be able to create both the physical security and the psychological benefit of housing as we've come to know it. In other words, a safe, stable, secure environment in which you can create and sustain networks, both immediate and more local. So I think we cannot separate housing from well-being as if it was some optional choice variable in a market economy. It's pretty clear that kids need stability in order to be healthy, in order to learn, in order to develop confidence and skills and capabilities. They need stable relationships both with adults and a peer group, and that they learn as much from a peer group as they do from the adults in their community, and often learn more from adults in the community than they will from their own parents. So one of the consequences of sort of post-war mono families of mum, dad, and two kids, apart from the fact that often those were unstable, but even when they were stable, the need for social connection beyond the household was even more important and yet increasingly less available. So the idea that we can bring up great kids in isolation from either their peer groups or a network of adults is incredibly naive. So social environments matter a lot in creating the next generation of thoughtful, empathetic, functioning adults. So the interesting observation about climate and weather is that often people want to believe that what we're experiencing is just weather, that somehow it's always been wet, or it's always been dry, or it's always been windy, and this is just more of that. And that on a sort of day-to-day and week-to-week basis, that's quite possible that you actually confuse the underlying systemic change in the climate with the experience of days or weeks in weather. And then some sort of catastrophic event comes along, a massive drought. So in Africa, they're in their 5th annual drought year on year in the Horn of Africa. That's not weather, that's climate. That when you end up with your 3rd 1 in 100 year flood in a year, that's not weather, that's climate. That in Australia, it took 3 years of fires, droughts, and floods to move the dial on public awareness that the climate was truly changing and that human activity was causing it. Now in New Zealand, we've had some recent weather events. I'm not convinced they've been severe enough or frequent enough yet for people to really get it. That 80% of New Zealanders accept that the climate is changing, that human activity is causing it, and we have to do something about it. But we still hang on to the idea that the something that needs to be done is by someone else and somewhere else. So central government needs to do something about this. Local government needs to do something about this. The idea of taking agency to empower leaders to make hard choices is beyond the idea that I need to buy an EV or I need to live in a house that isn't flood prone. It is about we need to make it possible in a democracy for leaders to make some difficult choices for us. And if we keep electing leaders who take soft choices and short-term interests, we will get what we chose. So I'm pretty certain that most New Zealanders now accept that climate is changing. It is only when we inconvenience ourselves that we will actually take the action we need to choose to retreat from the indefensible in the face of nature, that we decide to restore nature, maybe not a short-term economic imperative, but it is now an urgent imperative for all of us and in our own self-interest to do so. I think the impact in New Zealand of global climate change is very hard to predict, but let's take some for examples. It's pretty clear that relative to some parts of the world, New Zealand, by luck and nature, has got choices that other countries don't have. We're relatively sparsely populated. We can retreat to higher ground. We have enormous renewable energy choices with known technology to displace risky supply lines of liquid fossil fuels. We don't need to import large amounts of energy in order to sustain the kind of life and well-being that would be consistent with our 21st century expectations. So from that point of view, New Zealand has choice. The consequence is there are a lot of people going to want to come here. Some of them may be the million New Zealanders who already live offshore, who have a right of return. They just need to buy a ticket. They don't need permission to come home. Now, sure, in the pandemic, we locked the gates, but we also saw how that became extremely difficult to keep your own citizens out. But secondly, there are going to be a lot of relatively wealthy people who will see New Zealand as a safe harbour, safe haven, an ark in the storm. We're going to have to make some choices about who do we choose to come onto our lifeboat. And we are going to have some near neighbours in the Pacific whose homelands will be uninhabitable. And in my view, we have a greater obligation to, because of our place in the Pacific and the Pacific communities that have made New Zealand home. The science says very clearly, the science is unambiguous. There is more energy in the atmosphere as a result of it being warmer. It is warmer because of the carbon dioxide, but warmer is what causes the change in climate. The warmer air carries more moisture, so 1 degree warmer carries 7% more moisture. That's physics. It's not made up, it's not theoretical, it's actually measurable. And if it was only 1 degree and 7% more water, that wouldn't be the problem. The trouble is that already the temperature over land is 1.85 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and over the ocean about 0.85 of a degree, hence the average of 1.1. As the land temperatures rise faster, so we will find there is more moisture in the air in places, and in some places the temperature is 5 to 7 degrees warmer already. So over those places the air will carry 30% more water. And when that water comes down, it comes down in places it may not have rained before, and nature will find a way for that water to find the sea. So we are in harm's way when we build on floodplains, but it is not the case that everywhere that was once safe is now safe. Simple, the land was cheap. The land was cheap because it was flood prone. And Christchurch is a classic example, out in the Bexley area in the basin, all through the 40s, 50s, 60s, property developers wanted to develop that land. It was relatively close to a major urban area. It was flat. It looked like it was pretty easy to bring in. And repeatedly and consistently, people said, no, it's flood prone, don't build there. 1970s, the council of the time blinked, the developers got in, the houses were built in a combination of earthquakes, land sinkage, and now rainfall has created flooding on a floodplain. First of all, I think we need to be much more transparent about what we know. This idea that we can know that a site is earthquake prone or flood prone or wind exposed and somehow not make that publicly available on all property titles for all to see is a kind of sucker's game where I know but you don't know, so I might be able to sell to you and get out. I don't think that's a socially acceptable way of dealing with publicly available information. I think we need to make available to all of us everything that is known to inform decision makers, whether they're home buyers, mortgage lenders, insurers, regional authorities with rulemaking power. So that would be the first thing, information and publicly available in respect of specific sites would be a must do. Secondly, we have to be honest and say that we are not able to protect all of those things, physical assets that are exposed to the changing climate from loss and damage. That's an unreal expectation by owners of property that they will be made whole by the rest of society for any losses that they face. And thirdly, we should try and figure out how to be consistent where communities do face loss. And it shouldn't just be those who's faced early loss get first dibs and those who come later have less to claim. So I think developing our criteria for assessing the merits of access to public finance for support is going to be pretty critical. Not on a first come, first served basis, but surely on the basis of the most vulnerable and those most in need should be at the front of the queue. So the climate is different all over the planet, and it is interesting to see how different places, different communities over different eons have actually built differently in the context of their climate, because you can't beat it. If it's going to rain, you better figure out how to direct the rain away from where you want to sleep and live. One of the challenges, the speed with which the climate is changing is going to make it very difficult with the existing built infrastructure. So the first thing is let's start making sure when we build new stuff, we actually build it knowing about the coming change in climate. That's the where question, where we build. We can't unbuild what we built, but where we build next should be fully informed. The next thing is what we build, and that goes to the density, the shape. How we build it goes to the materials that we put into it. And then there's the question of the emissions during the lifetime of the operation of the built structure. So all of those things will have an impact on the environment, the use of resources, and the downstream impacts on the environment of what we've built and where we built it. So there will be new and emerging materials technologies that are associated with lower emissions. Whether it's a matter of figuring out how to make steel with much less coal. So you don't need coal for its thermal property. You're still going to need carbon, but maybe in the future biochar will be the source of the carbon for steel making, and renewable electricity will be the source of the heat in order to create steel. So it is the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air that is the cause of the real problem to the climate, setting aside the challenge to the environment of mining materials. So that's a separate but important environmental issue. We might be able to make cement with a lot less emissions in the future than we do today. So until these new technologies with lower emissions emerge, what we know we can do today is use less cement and less steel when it is currently made with high emissions. And what are the known alternative technologies? Well, they certainly include wood products. So wood products can substitute for some, but usually not all, of the concrete and steel that is needed. And it costs more because we're beginning to actually count the cost to the environment of things we used to throw away, like emissions. And a consequence of that is we probably might have to build smarter so that we are more focused on building the spaces that are used more intensively, common living spaces, rather than empty bedroom spaces. So configuring what we're building for the purpose of the inhabitants becomes really important. And then keeping an eye on, well, what are the emissions going to be needed to run and operate this building, whether it's a residential house or a commercial office building or a warehouse or a factory, because it depends on the structure, but roughly half of all the emissions over a lifetime of a building come after you open the door or turn on the lights for the first time. So we need to save the carbon emissions when we build. We need to save the emissions while we operate. We need to retrofit current buildings because most of the buildings that are going to be here in 2050 are already here today. And we need to use energy wisely in those buildings so that we don't have to keep creating ever more capacity to fire up the buildings that we've built. So it's a very complicated kind of yes and, yes and, yes and, rather than either or. Yeah, I'm less of a believer that it's the profit driven which drives us. I think that what we build is a function of a whole bunch of intersecting but now historical choices. So after the Second World War in Europe, they had an immense challenge just to house the population given the physical damage that had been made. So in the 50s and 60s, there were some experiments that went badly wrong with, large, densely populated apartment blocks, which lost any sense of social cohesion or community or belonging, and were literally, concrete cupboards for small family groups. We learnt from that. But you look at Singapore, and they've built tower blocks with creches and shopping centres and working spaces and lots of green space and parklands around them. And I'm not saying that we need to do what Singapore did, but Singapore found a solution to their problem, which was a desperate housing shortage after the Second World War in a particularly humid and hot environment where they were able to house their population in a context and in a way that created the safety, security, and community for that culture that was appropriate and relevant. The UK ended up with Milton Keynes, which still struggles to find cultural identity and sense of belonging for the people who live there. And I don't think Milton Keynes is the answer for New Zealand any more than I think the Singapore or Vancouver office style residential buildings are. So the question for New Zealand, what's our answer? What's right in our community for our way of living, given our population centres? And what works in Auckland won't work in New Plymouth or Southland. What works for a multi-generational family won't work for an elderly person who seeks a degree of solace. But to assume that there's one size fits all, whether it's the building materials or it's the physical structure of our communities, is to miss the point. That what we started talking about at the beginning is housing is an essentially social and cultural construct, but we then physically constrain our community and society by the built structures that we impose on ourselves. So how do we reopen the conversation about different for different places, different for different communities, different at different parts of your lifestyle? What works for a student first time living away from home in a hall of residence is not going to work for a young professional or a newly married couple or a family with baby, or with a family that's looking after elderly or aging parents, or a family and community with multi-interactive peer groups. So why would we think one size fits all? The challenge for New Zealand is we have a cottage industry for making houses, but we've somehow lost the opportunity to make different houses. So I think the first thing to remember is banks are regulated entities. So some of their behaviours are not entirely degrees of freedom of choice that the banks have. So this is a conversation that must involve the regulator, in our case in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank, that sets rules about the capital that's required by a bank in order to make a loan. and also the liquidity that banks have to hold. So while a borrower sees the rate they pay on the mortgage, what they don't see is the capital that was needed to support that mortgage, or the non-lending assets a bank has to hold so it has the liquidity to support a long-term loan from short-term funding. So all of that says, banks and regulators have got to play together in this world. Secondly, banks often have lent against the security of, if it all goes wrong, we can sell this homogenous like product back into the market, get our money back, and lend again. And that becomes a problem if the land is not owned by the same owner of the structure, who may not be the same as the resident in the structure. And so figuring out how do you configure security interests which protect the bank and its depositors, while at the same time recognizing that, say in iwi Māori culture, the land shouldn't be alienable from the longest possible horizon of ownership. So it's never going to be security that could be sold up in a fire sale and a mortgage. The built structures we need to build may need to be built to last hundreds of years to be environmentally sustainable. But they may be fitted out and refitted out every 10 or 15 years as the needs for that structure change, as the internal fit out is displaced or replaced. So how do we separate and then finance separately the land, which is inalienable, the built structure, which might last 200 years, and the fit out, which might circulate every 15 years? And at the moment, we bundle it all together and we'll lend you 70% of it. But maybe we could actually lend you very different amounts for very different purposes. And that may create more access to finance for creating a wider diversity of built environments in which communities can live. I think around housing, it is such a long-term challenge that, if you think of how we build our towns and cities, most of the footprints of New Zealand's towns and cities were laid down over 100 years ago. So where we chose to build 100 years ago was largely to do with access to water, either for drinking or transport. So we built our communities near the shore, near the rivers, for those two reasons: access to drinking water and access to transport. And 100 years later, we're still locked into basically our towns and cities are where those towns and cities were. Are they in the right place for the 21st century? And if they're not, it's unlikely we're going to pick them up and move them. So how do we think about both evolving where we are? There's no drainage system big enough to drain Auckland if it's now going to be subject to monsoon-like rainfalls. So the city of Auckland is not going to move anytime soon. So how do we retrofit it as if we had built it in a monsoon zone? How do the monsoon cities of the world become self-draining? What have they done to protect themselves from flooding? How do we learn from them and their built environment to retrofit our built environment? And as I say, it's not just a matter about building bigger drains, because there's so much water that we need to create safe corridors for that water to get out of the city. And that may mean we have to move some of the built structures from where they are and let nature and water have right of way. But that's a big challenge, right? The crossover of property rights, the write-off of existing infrastructure. Even in Christchurch after the earthquake, there was a nanosecond where we talked about redoing the street grid, but we didn't. So even the layout of the street network in Christchurch, after we knocked over 80% of the city, we kept the grid. It just shows how hysteresis binds us to past decisions. So the question is, how optimistic can we be about physically changing something as fundamental as where our towns and cities are and how they're laid out? And yet if we don't, we risk having flood after flood, fire after fire, storm after storm, and picking up broken bits.